Hello, my name is Bijan Kazai. I am the CEO of Hotel Resilient, and I'd like to take you through this short lesson on risk assessment. So, what I'll talk to you today is a introduction on the key concepts and terminologies of risk and the basic elements and processes in a risk assessment. I'll talk about risk assessment as a basic component of the larger risk management and resilience paradigm, and I'll talk about risk from the perspective of tourism destinations. And I'll touch on different approaches to risk assessment and conclude with how risk assessment can be used by destination managers and stakeholders. So, you've already seen PATA's Tourism Destination Resilience Framework in the introductory lesson. And in this framework, you can see how risk assessment is really the very start of the PATA Tourism Destination Resilience Framework. Essentially, the very core, if we're going to understand if a destination is going to be resilient, meaning its ability of withstanding adversity and bouncing forward from a crisis, or if sustainability is the goal, as the ability of that destination to be sustained for future generations and to endure in the long run. That process has to start with an understanding of risk, with a process of identifying, mitigating, and preparing for risk from multiple types of threats. Without a risk assessment, risk cannot be managed. As the famous adage goes, what is not measured cannot be managed. And managing risk is important because it's about building trust, managing a destination's reputation. It's about providing safety to visitors, safeguarding the welfare of the community, and protecting the destination's assets. So now that we reminded ourselves of the PATA Tourism Destination Resilience paradigm, let's take a step back and look at the concept of risk. The concept of risk essentially combines the probability of a hazard event or a threat occurring and the impact of that event in terms of loss or damage. So it will answer basic questions like what can happen, how likely is it going to happen, and given that an event occurs, a hazard event occurs, what are its consequences on the population, on the economy, on the environment? There is no universally accepted formula or definition for risk, but a common expression of risk, as I just showed in the previous slide, usually incorporates the terms of hazard and vulnerability. So hazard is the component that includes probabilities of occurrence of a natural or man-made event. Its potential spatial extent across geography, the severity of the event, how likely it is to occur. On the other hand, vulnerability is looking at the notion of how susceptible a system is. That could be a population, that could be environment, that could be economy, to the potential threat of a hazard. Or does it have the capabilities or resources to withstand those negative impacts of the hazard event? In this sense, a hazard is something that can cause harm, but a risk is the chance that any hazard will actually cause harm if assets that are exposed are vulnerable to the hazard. Think of an earthquake by itself as a triggering event. If it happens in a desert that has no infrastructure, there will be no damage to the infrastructure. But you have an earthquake in a dense urban area not built to resist earthquakes, and that will cause loss of life, injury, and damaged assets. So risk depends on the susceptibilities and capacities in a system. In that sense, it's a path to disasters as the protective capabilities of society cannot deal with the negative consequences of that event. Now let's look at where risk assessment comes in and how it links to the greater context of risk reduction as a paradigm. So risk reduction only takes place when it's treated as a process that incorporates risk assessment, risk communication, and risk management tools. Risk assessment is the process of collecting, analyzing information about the nature, likelihood, and severity of disaster risks. So it answers questions, as we had mentioned, what can go wrong? What's the likelihood of it going wrong? What are the consequences? On the other hand, without communicating and creating the appropriate awareness of risk assessment findings may never be integrated within the agenda and functions of different agencies, such as DMOs or local governments in a destination. Finally, we have to have systematic risk management practices which allow for the application of risk assessment findings through policies, strategies, in order to have risk reduction as an outcome. In this sense, risk assessment can be understood as a basic instrument for integrating risk reduction practices into a destination's management strategy. Okay, so let's look at the process of a risk assessment. It goes through several steps. At the very top level is the hazard assessment procedure, which aims to assess and estimate all the possible hazards that can affect an area, the so-called participative possible hazards. Next is a vulnerability analysis, where the vulnerability of infrastructure, of population groups, of the environment, as well as gaps and weaknesses in their existing coping strategies are evaluated and analyzed. Once these two components have been addressed, the potential impacts of hazard events on a destination can be quantified through different types of risk assessment methods. The final step of this process is the interpretation of the impacts on a destination and its available resources. This is a most critical step of risk assessment, which provides key parameters to a destination's risk management strategy and essentially is the basis for any type of risk-sensitive planning and development. One basic risk assessment method allows for the comparison of different types of perils is the risk matrix method, which looks at the likelihood and consequences of different types of perils. Consequences can be loss of life, damage to infrastructure. It could be the cost of replacing the damaged infrastructure. It could also look at indirect impacts like the drop in arrivals or the loss of production and services in a destination. However, losses and consequences are captured, it's important then to show this in a comparative scale that goes from negligible to catastrophic. At the same time, it's important for those consequences per peril to be looked at in terms of how likely or how frequent are they. Is it a rare event, or is one that happens is it something that happens every 500 years, every 50 years, or is it a flood that happens annually? And in this example, it can be seen that a flood, for example, which has high consequences and very likely to occur, can be prioritized over a drought, which has lesser consequences and less likely to occur. The tourism industry is not at all prepared for the level of risk that it's exposed to, especially with the impacts of climate change. There are a number of tools that look at hazards from different perils. One platform that brings all of this together globally at a 10-kilometer resolution and is free to use is the Hotel Resilient platform. Here, a destination can look at hazard levels from different types of perils, including the impacts of climate change, but the platform also allows hotels in a destination to enter information about their vulnerability. And it's the interaction between the vulnerability and the hazard that allows them to also be able to get a detailed footprint of their risk, so a risk profile of their hotel property. There are different tools and approaches to risk assessment, but the risk assessment and risk management process has actually been standardized and described in ISO 31000 in terms of principles, framework, and processes that were originally developed for organizations, but they can be adapted by destinations and integrated into the various functions and activities of destination management organizations. So the first are the principles, which provide guidance on the characteristics of an effective risk management, which communicates its values and intention and purpose. This could be whether a risk assessment management process is integrated by looking at different types of perils, different types of participating hazards. Is it inclusive? Is it looking at it from multiple types of stakeholders? Is it holistic? Does it look at only physical assets and infrastructure, or does it also look at human and cultural factors? So in that sense, ISO 31000 sets forth a number of principles for the risk management process. Then it's important to look at the risk management process in terms of systematic applications of policies, procedures, and practices, from establishing a context of risk in a destination to all the different steps in a risk assessment, from identifying the risk to analyzing the risk, evaluating it, and finally treating it. This doesn't happen in a silo. The ISO 31000 proposes a constant process of communication and consultation with stakeholders, and also an understanding that risk is dynamic and has to be continually monitored and reviewed as different contexts of risk, different types of risk, different levels of risk, different types of stakeholders are emerging. And the last element of this is the framework, which assists a destination in integrating its risk management strategies into its own activities and functions, and a process for the continual evaluation and improvement of risk management. So ISO 31000 also provides guidance for DMOs to shift from mainly a response-oriented crisis management mindset, which is unidimensional function of a specific agency, such as police or civil protection, to a multi-sectoral interagency process that includes consultations with all stakeholders in a destination. In that sense, it's not just looking at operational processes to manage a post-event situation. It's looking at integrating and mainstreaming risk management into the functional processes of various actors and stakeholders in a destination, with the ultimate goal of improving the safety and welfare of the population by minimizing disruption of services, protecting assets, but also by looking at planning and development processes and ensuring that these are risk sensitive. So in conclusion, risk assessment is more than just a mere exercise for experts to understand the impact of potential hazards. It is above all a process that provides a tool to decision making and engages stakeholders in the process of risk management. Risk assessment can be used to estimate human and material losses and how it's distributed across different geographies and sectors. It can be used to estimate impact on critical infrastructure. It can be used to prepare and plan for emergencies. And finally, it's an excellent tool for communicating risk parameters to different stakeholders in a destination, and forcing transparency and providing all the necessary inputs, risk inputs, for developing a destination's management strategy. So with that, I conclude. Thank you for your attention and wish you the best of luck in concluding your training with PATA's Tourism Destination Resiliency Program.